Dr. Post is the Buehler Professor of Emergency Medicine and Medical Social Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine of Northwestern University, and she is the inaugural director of the Buehler Center for Health Policy and Economics. She has been working in information technology, which is sometimes called informatics, information technology and violence prevention and intervention for the past 20 years. If there is anything that ties together all of the different kinds of research that she has done, she has said that that link is addressing risk factors of vulnerable populations, both here in the United States and across the world. And I know we'll hear more about that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lorianne Post.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to come. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I, as an undergraduate, studied international development and African studies, and then I studied demography, theoretical demography as a master's student, and then as a PhD student, I studied demography again. As a postdoc, I've studied everything from geographical information systems to epidemiology. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I ended up in the career that I have now, or how I came into violence when I started off doing something completely different. All right, and I think as Cynthia already said, I'm a professor at Northwestern University. I am not an MD, I'm a PhD. I work in emergency medicine. Emergency medicine fits me very well because all of the social problems of the world walk through the emergency department front doors. So my work overlaps with several other faculty there. And in emergency medicine, we're concerned what brings people to the emergency department and what happens after the emergency department visit. We're not just concerned with what happens while you're there at the emergency department. Okay, so one of the things I was going to talk about is like sort of like, you know, you look backwards in your life and you think about how did I end up here? That was kind of really weird. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I find that my career was kind of a circuitous route to where I ended up. So I was just going to give you a little background there. So basically, I left home when I was age 17. I went to live in Brazil, and I lived in a little town called Botucatu, Brazil. And because I already had graduated high school, I went to med school there. And in Brazil, you don't need to go to undergrad first before you go to medical school. You just have to take a test. And if you can pass the test, you go straight into med school when so I did that by the time I was 18 years of age. And so my Portuguese was not very strong at the beginning. So I didn't really want a degree in medicine. So I just did a lot of labs. And that meant I did toxicology, pharmacology, and human anatomy. So I did that for a while, 1981 to 1982. Then I came back to the United States. And then as I mentioned, I started off at Michigan State University. And I was doing a degree in international development. And it came down to the last year, and it turns out that, oh my God, I'm short 8 credits. I need 8 science credits to graduate. And I was thinking, what am I going to do? Because I was expecting to graduate. And so I needed to do something quick over the summertime. And so I found there was a program, an overseas studies program, that was human identification. It was for anthropologists and criminologists. Anybody studying criminology, which is, the science, is also one of the disciplines within sociology. And I found one that was just straight science credits called, and it had classes in forensic science, human identification, and forensic odontology, which is a study of your teeth. So at the University of London is where I started off, and then I went over to Cambridge to finish up. And one of the things that was that we had to do studying human identification, not only was I looking at human remains all the time, but one of the things we had to do to be able to graduate is I had to go to an autopsy. So in those days, that was 1987, there were no cell phones, but there were pagers. And so I would hang out with the other students, and because we were working on homicides or, you know, human remains or whatever, other people didn't really like to hang out with us during, you know, for meals. So I was always sitting with the other forensic scientists, talking, yapping about. So anyways, and we're waiting for somebody to drop dead so that we would be able to finish up the course and we would have an autopsy to attend. And so it was life defining, the autopsy. So somebody drops dead. It's a poor woman who's out. She was 80 some years old. And I believe she was at a grocery store, some kind of shopping with her daughter, and she dies. And so had this been America, basically they would have just said, oh, she's dead. And they would have, you know, sent her, they would have signed off on her, you know, death certificate that she died from. They would ask, did she have any problems? Does she have cancer, or did she have heart condition, diabetes, whatever? They would have just guessed at what it was. And we estimate in America about 40% of death certificates are wrong. So in England, it's really different because you automatically get an autopsy unless you're under the care of a doctor and you've been to see your doctor within the last 2 weeks. So that means pretty much everybody gets an autopsy. And that is very different from America, because in America, autopsies cost a lot of money. We only do them when we suspect foul play and there's been a homicide, or sometimes the family will want to know if somebody, you know, there was a suicide versus a homicide. Or anyways, so during this autopsy, it was really interesting. The first thing that happened is the pathologist, he cracked the chest, and they open up the chest right away. First thing they do is they pull out her heart. Her heart is enlarged. He puts it on the scale, and then he shows us the blockage, and he goes, see, there you go. She died from a heart attack. And so had that been America and they had done an autopsy, that would have been the end of the autopsy. We would have said she died from an MI, right? But in the case of England, they have a standard autopsy, and you have to do a whole bunch of different things. The autopsy is not over yet. So this woman, so basically we know she did have a heart attack. There was a blockage. She had an enlarged heart. We could see what killed her, but they kept going. And then, so one of the next things that he did is that you have to look underneath the, you know, the skin on the head and stuff like that. So they slice around your ears and cut around there, and they always slide that up over the head. And then they'll have a look at the brain, because you could also have things going on in the brain as well, like stroke or something like that. And it was really interesting because on top of her head, you could see that she had a bunch of injuries on the very top of the head, not on the side of the head. And because we're studying injuries and patterns of injuries on dead people, we know that when you bump your head, like when you're on the airplane, you don't bump your head just exactly on top. Or if you hit something or run into a door or whatever, it's always on the side of your head like that. And this woman had a whole bunch of injuries on top of her head, and they were, you know, so she had bruises, signs of bruises. And then after they slid off the skin of her head, we could see that she had subdural hematomas, which means that she had injuries like that was showing up under her skin there. And like, so it'll show up like sores or blisters or whatever, and you can see that. So that means she's been recently injured on top of her head. And then the other thing that was so disturbing when I'm watching this autopsy is that after they slid the skin off over the head, we could see the subdural hematomas, but we can also see her skull. And had that been America, that would have been the end of the autopsy again, but not in England. You also have to do an x-ray of the body. So we look at her body, and because I've been studying osteology, I knew that this woman had injuries all over her body that were consistent with recent, like on top of the head, subdural hematomas, but she also had bone that had remodeled on top of her head, broken bones that had healed. So we could see injuries that basically went across her whole lifespan. So when you're a kid, I don't know, you know, a lot of kids do more risky things. I know I did some dumb things and broke my foot before. So there would still be evidence now on broken bones that have, you would see where they healed or where the fractures healed, and we call it remodeling as the bone puts down osteoblast as it heals. So, but anyways, but you can tell kind of how old injuries are, and you can tell the nature of injuries. And we know basically injuries that are defensive, and we know injuries that are, that are more prone to accidents, like certain things that you break or what you break or how you break, whatever. Anyways, but her body was consistent with her being injured, not from accidents. Anyways, so and the guy, he pulls her hair back down and her scalp back over her head, and he goes, God, I see that all the time. And he explained it to us. He goes, yeah, look, she's got subdural hematomas. She's got bone remodeling, multiple stages of remodeling here. And he said, definitely these are, somebody's injured her. And then he goes, okay, that's it. And then he writes down on the death certificate, the cause of death, which he put down was MI. So she died of a heart attack. And so I kept thinking, did she die of a heart attack or did she die of something else? So she did die of a heart attack. But what led to that heart attack? Because we know, like, sometimes anxiety, stress, whatever was not good for your heart. Anyways, it was just like disturbing how he said that how frequent it was and how nonchalant he was, and how he didn't record any of these other things on her body. He didn't mark up her autopsy card, and he did this full autopsy that included, an x-ray that included, looking under the skin, and we see all this evidence of violence. And so I went to see Henry V that night because I'm in London, and when you're in London, you want to see really good Shakespeare play. And I'm just disturbed. And I spent my, dinner kind of quiet, didn't really feel like talking to people, but I go to the play. I'm with my classmates there. Henry V is rallying up his soldiers, and they're going into battle, and they know that they're going to die. They know they're not going to win it. So how do you convince a group of people to go ahead and, and to basically like go to their deaths? And he did it. And Shakespeare they gave a really beautiful speech to his men, how we will not go quietly into the night. Anyways, and that speech is also done on alien invasion of the United States, where the president of the United States uses the same speech from Henry V, where he says, we will not go quietly into the night. But basically the whole thing is we're going to die. So let's make a lot of noise, and let's make sure that, history remembers us. And that was really like the opposite experience of what I saw with this autopsy. So this woman suffered a life of violence, and then she took it to her grave, and nobody knows about all this suffering. Nobody did anything about it. And there was no way to mark the end of her life. It's like, my God, nobody, knew that she was a victim of violence, or, maybe they did. Some people did. I don't know. So anyway, so that was just something that bothered me a lot. It stuck with me. But, I didn't have much to do with it. I wasn't an expert in violence. I was just finishing off 8 credits of science. And then I went back to Michigan State University. And then because I was at MSU, I stayed on there, and I went on for a master's degree. And my master's degree was in intergenerational socioeconomic status and its impact on fertility, which it says right there. And so I did my master's in that area. And if you're smart, you do your PhD on the same topic. And so I am having a hard time, struggling, just basically I wasn't feeling it, And I'd already defended my dissertation. I already had 3 chapters were written on my dissertation. And then 4 of the women faculty came to talk to me, which we'll get back to that in a minute. But basically, I just was so bored with the topic, and I felt like, who really cared? It was a really stupid topic. And it was about theory that was developed that happened during the baby boom after World War II, when we had this unprecedented number of babies being born, we all know, called the baby boom. And so I was looking at, like, what were the causes of that? And really the underlying causes of fertility, meaning how many babies a woman has, is very different after World War II than it was at the time I was writing my dissertation. So anyway, so here we are. So I go back, I'm back in America. I'm studying fertility, and something else comes up. I wasn't liking my topic. I thought it was really boring, and probably it would have left me with the dull career. Anyways, so now I'm going to talk about some fun things that I got into, which is wildlife biology, um, some ancient demographers, and then there's a $3 million taco. Okay. So what happens to me is, it just so happened we had 4 women chairs at Michigan State University. One of them was the chair of sociology. I was a sociologist, which is where demography usually is. The chair of my department, Janet Boekmeyer, was interested in violence against women. And then there was the chair of criminal justice. Mary Marash was interested in violence against women as well. There was Chris Sullivan from psychology. And then there was Diane from social work. So these 4 women asked to talk to me because I did a lot of methods and stats types of things, and it was an interesting meeting. And they sat me down. First of all, I was like, geez, what do they want? And they brought up the issue of domestic violence, and something that they wanted to answer the question of is they believe that domestic violence goes on throughout a whole lifetime, and that it's not being enumerated. So if you look at any kind of a survey, older women are pretty much missing from it for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about those as we go on. The other thing is that if there is any domestic violence studies, that they would focus only on physical and criminal abuse. And so we know there's a lot of violence that happens that doesn't raise to the threshold of criminal, but is enough to ruin people's lives. And so what I saw as the problem was that sociologists it's very common for them to do lots of interviews. They do, that's how we know so much about fertility, women's behavior, whatever, families, how big a family you have. We know all that because we do surveys, and we sit down with people and have long interviews, and we can follow them across their life in panel studies. But if anybody's ever known or been a victim of domestic violence, you know that you don't have the privilege of, the freedom to talk to your local sociologist. So face-to-face interview, if you are going to rely on interviews, basically, which was what happened, is they find out that they're women, it's really rare, they're really not being abused. And actually men are more likely to be abused than women are. That was the prevailing science at the time, which was stupid. And so I kept thinking about, well, that one experience that I had, of how I was able to see a woman who was battered was because she didn't get to consent. We didn't consent her, she was dead. And so I started thinking about, what if we could do something with dead women, that we could estimate the prevalence of domestic violence, because we can't do an interview. And then I started thinking about, who would these battered women come in contact with? There's the domestic violence shelters. They really weren't turning up a lot of older women. Tend to be more younger women, like with little kids. The police and prosecutor would have a few cases, but not very often. And there are like all types of like outreach services, from healthcare to domestic violence outreach services, whatever. But there was something I wanted to figure out, the prevalence of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, however you want to call it. But I thought I can't do an interview, clearly, because women are allowed to talk to. And in the Violence Against Women Act, the law started changing across America. So basically, if the police are called to a house for a domestic, they call them domestics, or for assault, battery, that in the old days, they used to just say, go take a walk, cool down, you two, knock it off, you two, whatever. And then the police would leave. And of course, the woman would be beaten again. But after the Violence Against Women Act was passed, then there started becoming more and more pressure for police departments to arrest the perpetrator, or if they're not going to arrest the perpetrator, they had to fill out a lot of paperwork explaining why this didn't rise to the threshold of an arrest. And so I looked before and after at mandatory arrest laws. So some states started getting, pro arrest policies. Some states had mandatory. Michigan had mandatory laws. And so I found that in states where you had the discretion of the police officer, if the police officer had to make a decision, he was not arresting older women, or not older women, older men, basically. So as people got older, there was less likely to be an arrest. And we know that there was not likely to be arrests even for younger people. So where does this bring me? So I found out also in East Lansing, where Michigan State was at, I talked to the chief of police there, and I looked at their records, and I found that when the laws passed because of the Violence Against Women Act, that after there was a mandatory or there's a mandate that the police officer has to arrest the batterer if somebody physically abuses a woman. And then we noticed that all of a sudden the average age of batterers started to increase dramatically. So it went from something that was very young to something that was more middle-aged. That was kind of weird. So the average age of your batterer, it increases if you have mandatory prevalence laws. So I wanted to, so that was an important thing. So I started noticing that the police aren't arresting batterers. So I know that we can't interview women because their batterers don't let them have free time. And then I came across this study here too. This is really important. So I find, like, for demographers, we have different ways that we do estimates of populations. We do intercensal estimates. We do all kinds of surveys. We do the decennial censuses. We just finished one up right now, and we know there's lots of problems with it. So there's this guy, Haakon the seventh. He was a king of Norway, and then somewhere around the late, I think it was about 1898, he wanted to know how many deer he had in his royal forest. And so because of him, some wildlife biologists came up with a technique to estimate the prevalence of deer. And so I'm not going to get into the stats of this one here, but basically you would just at time one, you would go into the woods and you would shoot 100 deer. You don't kill them. They would tag their ears. And then at time two, you come back and shoot another 100 deer, and then you look at the overlap. And so basically we operationalize the overlap, and we know that the overlap 5 is to 100, as 100, which is the number for the second capture, is to the whole population. So that's just simple. It's a unity. That's a simple model there. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that just shows you how they are. So I started finding these studies, and then they were doing them in Germany. They're doing them in all over Scandinavia. It started in the late 1800s, and they're counting fish. They're counting deer. It was so cool. And I thought wildlife biologists they're about 100 years ahead of demographers or social scientists and estimating techniques of population size. So then something else happened. I found some other studies, some really famous demographers who had long since been dead. So we all know what happened before World War II. The majority of the population lived in rural areas, and majority of Americans were farmers, and that kind of switched between the 1920s up until about 1940. The men go off to the war, they come back. We all know what happens is that a lot of people move from farmland to towns, and from towns to cities. And they were doing intercensal estimates using the technique that the wildlife biologists used. They started using it in 1947 to estimate the population, because we noticed that the population had changed significantly since 1940, and we had another few years to wait until the next census. And so they wanted to figure out how to do it. So then there are some, I found a study, and when I say a $3 million taco, I literally was just obsessed with this. And I found somebody who had modified the study that the demographers did and the animal wildlife biologists did. And they were interested in the ratio of heroin users, intravenous heroin users, to the number of people with HIV. And all of a sudden the ratio changed. And so somebody was going into the morgue, and they were looking at cadavers, and they were looking for track marks, and that they started to enumerate them. And then they did a crossover of a population, and it was like, oh my God, I can do this. And so I figured I can count the number of battered women if I can get the medical examiner, the police, and the prosecutor, and the local shelter to agree to do it. And so I wrote a proposal, and it was funded for these 4 women who are working on domestic violence, and I was still just a graduate student. And so I couldn't get very excited about my dissertation. And so I asked Janet, the chair, I'm like, can I change my mind? I can't do this. I'm obsessed with this new study. I really want to do it. And so basically I dropped my dissertation. I rewrote another one. It took me about a month to write up a proposal for defense. And then I ended up being in a fully funded study and defended within a year. So I wanted to show you like what I ran across too is I not only looked at like, doing, the indirect estimation of the number of battered women that there were, but do you guys all know who this is? You can raise your hand. So we all know Colonel Potter from MASH. He looks just like my father-in-law. He's one of the cutest men ever. And if you were to see him, wouldn't you want to just give him a hug, right? Because he's so sweet. And I thought it was really interesting to me because he's part of the problem. So I found how much ageism is like racism, and you throw in gender with ageism and it's horrible too. It's not perceived as dangerous. It's women who are battered are perceived, they think that women are crazy. I heard a lot of police call them crazy. They're described as crazy in police reports and prosecutor reports. Older women who are battered that call the police don't know what to do. They have nowhere to put this guy. So therefore they're going to find a place for the woman to stay. Like, does she have some family, or even to the point where they were putting her in long-term care settings where she didn't belong in a long-term care setting. He belonged in prison or in jail. Older men were way less likely to be arrested until the mandatory arrest laws made that average age drive up. The charges are more likely to be dropped for older men than they are for younger men because Colonel Potter does not look very dangerous. But did you know that Colonel Potter beat his wife so much that on 3 occasions he put her into the hospital? He terrorized her. He would get mad at her and destroy all their furniture, their house. And his most recent documented altercation where she was severely injured and hospitalized, he was 81 years old. And then here I told you already about the Violence Against Women Act. That was such an important thing. And a lot of progress was made for battered women, vulnerable women. But Violence Against Women Act was limited to women aged 18 to 65. Why would you cut off 65 and older? And so the state of Michigan had done a survey on domestic violence, and then they found out, oh my God, we made a mistake and we interviewed women who are 65 to 100 whatever years of age, and they wanted to cut out those people and throw them away because they didn't match their sample, which was the target sample for Violence Against Women Act. They're only supposed to fund 18 to 65-year-old. And somehow I got a hold of the sample and I was just surprised, really surprised. So older women, something was happening. I did the study twice, once in Marquette, the county of Marquette, and once in the county of Kalamazoo. And I found that older women were more likely to be in a reorganized relationship. And what I mean by that is that if you start getting to be over the age of 65, a lot of men had their heart attacks and died, in their 40s and 50s. And so women would get a second husband. They would have had a perfectly fine first one. And then one thing that would happen, the new husband would be violent, and then they would be really humiliated and they wouldn't know what to do. And they were in a new relationship and they didn't know how to get out of it or how they should act. They thought, well, shelters aren't for me, they're for young women. They were scared and they were alone. And then also a Boston study then was conducted right at the same time. And they found that as soon as there was a mandatory arrest rate, then automatically the profile turned white and the profile turned older. And that means that police officers that are making decisions are thinking white men aren't as dangerous as black men. That's kind of racist. And then old men are not harmful because, they're letting them go. It was when it was up to the officer to make a decision. Okay, so basically the conclusions of the DEER study, I did this, it was domestic elder abuse research study.
and I called it the deer study because it was based on the other deer study, or how to count deer. So I found that battering of older women is as pervasive among older couples. And it was approximately 5% of women in an active relationship were assaulted within the past year. National surveys that were done on domestic violence, it would always show that there were lower rates of domestic violence for older women, but that was because women were not in relationships. Okay, then the other thing that I started turning up from, I started going to medical examiners, to the morgues, to autopsies. And so I was just linking up women, older women who contacted the police, who showed up in shelter, who were dead, had to be dead. So, and I found that a crazy number of these women were falling down the stairs and dying, and happened to have been made police reports, and happened to also be hiding at shelters. And this was very rare to happen. But that was really strange that that I think these are women that went quietly into the night. And I'm not saying that these are like hundreds and hundreds of women, but there were definitely in the 1 year there, I found 19 women in the county of Kalamazoo who had a really, I would say, a death that made it look like she was it was attributed to her being, like, falling down the stairs. So basically domestic violence for older women, I found it was I found different types of it. One of them I would just call late onset. So basically life changes, such as the empty nest, women who are alone for the first time. Sometimes men retire, and men define themselves by their careers, by their jobs or whatever. And sometimes some men become violent for the first time when they're faced with, like, these life changes. And then also it was retirement. Or the other thing is women are more likely to be in a reorganized family due to a death, divorce, remarriage. And then I also saw something that was kind of interesting, that with older people, then sometimes somebody has health issues, the other person is taking care of them. So if the man is taking care of the woman, he's way more likely to abuse her, to be, physically abusive, psychologically abusive. And then I also found something kind of odd too, which was flip flop. Basically, women who had been abused through a lifetime had that the only cases I ever found of women who abused men had been victimized throughout their life. And then when the health flipped on their husband, they became abusive. But that was a very small percentage of, like, 4% of all cases. So then the other thing is there's just good old fashioned woman abuse grown old. So some of the women just have been abused across their whole lifetime. So these are very different characteristics for older women, and really important differences to make, because we have to know why things happen or how they happen, because that can help us in our prevention. So anyway, so then the questions went on with, did the incidence of women abuse decrease for older women? And I started looking at the difference between, or the relationship between, non-physical violence and physical violence over the life course. So as you all know, if you beat somebody up, now you are more likely to get arrested, not necessarily, but more likely to. But there's a lot of things you can do to a partner. You can be coercive, manipulative, and controlling, that doesn't rise to the threshold of something illegal where you can arrest. And I just kind of became interested in that. And this was the people that I snagged the study that we did have after, and I kept in older women, but then the numbers became so few. But I did get up quite a few women that were between the ages of 65 and 69. And as you can see, if you add them together, so non-physical abuse and physical abuse, you add them up, it still stays pretty high. We're talking in the high 20s there over. And so basically I would find sometimes as physical violence would go down, it would be psychological, or what we would call autonomy limiting behavior, or psychological. And I can just give you some examples of that. Some autonomy limiting behavior could be something where
I just called you. Why did it take you 10 phone rings for you to answer the telephone? Who are you with? What are you doing? No, you're not going out with your family. Your mom just wants to separate us, or, things that men say and do to not let women be free or whatever. They're not allowed to have jobs because that interferes with his control of her, whatever. Then there's also this like psychological abuse too, is like, you're so stupid and ugly. Nobody would marry you. If it wasn't for me, you would have no partner. That kind of a thing, or threats of violence would also go along with it too. But basically, I would find that as one went down, the other one would escalate or take over. So, and then saw something too. As a sociologist, I believe it's so important that you look at your subject from all sides. And I was kind of interested in batterers, and they started something called batterers treatment programs at the time of the Violence Against Women Act. And so there was one person I was working with who was just focusing on batterers, and this is what they were finding, is that there's really a natural hierarchy of perpetrators that fall out over and over. With the psychological manipulators, they maintain the top strata of these batterers treatment groups. So basically, a judge catches you beating your wife or partner, and then you get sent to batterers treatment group, which is different than anger management. And it started out as anger management. That's another conversation. But basically, batterers need to really be held accountable, and it's a very different dynamic than losing your temper. So anyway, so batterers become sophisticated over a short time period, and it's based on experiential learning plus pure training as well. So basically, if you think about it, to beat up your wife or to physically batter somebody, it's not a good long plan, right? Because you can get arrested, you could lose your job. You can, you have social repercussions. So if you can stop the physical violence and increase your control of your wife, your partner, you no longer need to batter her. Anyway, so battering is not as effective. Physical battery is not as effective as psychological tactics. We found that out, and that battering is physically challenging. And the older you get, less likely you want to do it. It takes a lot of physical strength to beat somebody up for 3 minutes. And sometimes women report being beaten, over the course of several hours or days. The other thing too is that some desistance, and physical violence does attenuate, but it can be a true decrease in abuse. There's a small category of batterers who are immature kids or with alcohol or something like that does decrease. But mostly it's just, it just switches to non-physical forms of control. So one of the things I thought, this was just an interesting thing, where a guy I was visiting, sitting quietly observing a batterers treatment group, and one guy had been bounced back into jail because he hit his partner after being sent to batterers treatment, or batterers therapy, batterers treatment group. And then one of what I would say, how I mentioned there's like a hierarchy in the batterers treatment groups. The guy who was really running the group, not really the leader, but it's one of the other batterers, they try to hold each other accountable. And he just says, you still need to hit her? What's wrong with you? It's basically like they like put this guy down who physically assaulted his wife as being, inferior, because he needed to still hit her to maintain control and dominate her. So some of the takeaways I, wanted to talk about on my this part of my career here is that, really study something that you like. It seemed to me like a big risk to like throw away a dissertation, but I'm so glad I did, because really, who cares about how many children women want to have? This wasn't that interesting of a topic for me. And the other thing is I think what I had so much fun in my life doing was taking information from outside of my field that nobody else was doing. And I've kind of done that my whole career in a variety of ways. And I think that thinking outside the box to solve your problem is really important. So to me, reading a wildlife biologist methodology book was just like life defining and so interesting. And then finding how people were able to solve problems or how, you know, whatever, and applying that to your topic is important. The other thing for me, I believe really, I feel really strongly, there's a lot of researchers that go out and conduct research. They never leave their office. They get a database or they collect data and they crunch numbers, but you can't really understand something if you don't observe it and if you don't take a look at it from multiple directions. So for me, it was really important to see how men and women interacted, how batterers controlled women. The whole thing was just a schooling for me. You know, I knew nothing at all about it. So for my dissertation, I wrote a proposal that was funded by the CDC for $3 million. And I said that was like my $3 million taco that I had. And then since then, I've had about $40 million in funding. Mostly it's been violence. And I've, you know, throughout my whole career, I've been pretty focused on older adults. And I feel that another thing too is like, do something that you really care about. That's one thing I love about the field of academia. It's so fun because you know, you get to study something new. It's always changing, always new questions out there. And I feel very excited about it. And then one of the things I have to say, one of the most important things I ever did in my life was I developed a background check system and for people who work in long-term care. And so my study became the pilot and became the national model. And I was able to write the language that was passed in the Affordable Care Act that granted every state and territory $3 million to build a system based on the Michigan study that I did. So it's kind of interesting in the field of academia. It's much less prestigious to do applied research, but to me it was so much more important because you saw like a direct relationship between the research that you do and outcomes. And the kind of a fun fact there is I was doing background checks. I designed background checks that would catch predators. And then there was Senator Cole he was the head of the Special Committee for Aging. And so at the time when they voted on this, it was so fun. They were trying to push it through as a separate bill first, but it didn't get, almost everybody voted for it. There were just a couple of Republicans that didn't vote for it. But at the time, Kennedy was there and Rockefeller was there too. And when Cole was pushing this through on the Special Committee for Aging. And that was a long time ago. So, and you can ask me questions if you'd like.
What was it like as a woman coming up in the statistics field? And what are you currently working on? I understand you have something to do with opioid study right now.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So I work in the areas called injury control. Injury control, it's like a portfolio of projects. So basically the same methods that you use for violence. I do gun studies, mass shootings, suicides, opioids, whatever. Those are all considered injury. Opioids was sort of more of a stretch for me, but the CDC put it within their portfolio. So it became involved with a lot of other studies. So I started doing opioids.
And is there some way to determine if somebody's going to become a batterer?
Yeah, like when they're 7. So anti-personality, that's so interesting. That's a great question. So anti-personality disorders are observable by the time a child is 7. That's famous studies that were done out of Chicago at least 30 years ago. I think that here's the thing is that you can identify somebody with a personality disorder. That means they're cold. It's not really like a disorder. They just don't have a soul in them, or they're more likely to do that. But the one thing that's consistent, there's who's to say how much of it is nurture versus nature. And so I think it's like people with that are cold. And then also I think men that are never held accountable. And let me see this one as well too, is that a lot of people will almost every time I ever give a presentation, I could be at the United Nations or I could be in a classroom of undergrads. It doesn't really matter where I'm at. The first question is always, what about the women who abuse men? And so
let me nip that one in the bud right here, is that yes, there are on occasion women do abuse men. It's usually for very different reasons. It's the objective, women manipulate, coerce men, usually to get something out of them. The objective isn't just to control them or run their life. Of course, there's always exceptions too, but I've done other studies on the ratio of male to male on female and female on male violence, and using capture recapture techniques, right? And it's not a 50-50 thing at all. It's a very rare thing for it to happen with women.
And how can we push? It sounds like a lot of this information is sort of hidden. Like, is there a need for appropriate laws so that we would reveal more of this information?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's completely correct. I feel that, you know, there's marginalized people, and then I started to find I work at a global level. It's a global issue, and sometimes we have this myth in our head that, you know, we become the old folks in this, you know, in African cultures or Asian cultures they're so well revered and respected, and all the youth bow down to them and care or whatever. It's not true at all. Old people are marginalized pretty much globally, and if you're a widow, it's way more likely to be worse. And so, in the types of exploitation and abuse of older women goes from horrible to really, really horrible. I think we need special protections, but I think also just an awareness that like Colonel Potter there, he was a horrible batterer, and nobody knew about it, or and people knew about it, didn't really care or whatever. So I think it's a good to show him as, you know, this is an example of what can happen.
Heard anything interesting in your gun violence studies?
Yeah. Here's let me tell you that one. That one always results in death threats whenever I publish anything on guns. I have a paper in right now on mass shootings. So I do mass shootings. It's an interesting study. I definitely believe that that people who commit mass shootings, they're plotters, they're thinking about it, they have fantasies a lot like serial killers, or even batterers. They're very similar to it. Also, let me say this too. You can't find a mass killer or a serial killer who doesn't have a prolific domestic violence history, by the way. So so I'm doing one right now on mass shootings, and one thing that really bothers me deeply is that we attribute it to crazy people, right? That we've got mental health problems. And I just had the last shooting that happened in Texas. The governor just like, this is horrible, this is awful, we got to do something about all these people with mental health problems. And again, it's not a mental health problem. These are psychopaths. They're psychopaths I differentiate from sociopaths. They're planners. So they know, they're smart enough to know where to get their ammunition, how they should dress, where to find the people they want to kill. They have fantasies about it. They write about it. They have signs they're going to commit these homicides. There's nothing about them at all that indicates mental illness. It's very rare. People with mental health issues have a hard time, taking showers every day, taking care of their personal life. They cannot organize a mass shooting where they kill dozens of people. And they just couldn't put a plot together like that. It's very rare. Out of since 1966, I can think of 2 cases where there was probably a serious mental health disorder, or documented mental health disorder. Also, something interesting, just an FYI, the definition of a mass shooting is a mass shooting in a public place where 4 or more people are killed. And we believe that the contagion for a mass shooting is the media. And so, some of the nice newspapers have stopped giving names because mass shooters have fantasies. I want to be called like, the Boston Strangler, or they get nicknames. So we have the Parkland shooter, we have the Sandy Hook killer. And so if we stop giving them these names, they'll stop having those fantasies. So my question to you is, when do you think was the last mass shooting if the media is the contagion? So the answer to that is the last time we had a mass shooting was is February of 2020. What happened is that COVID happened, and it's not because people are locked down that they can't go out and shoot people. And of course, they could still find crowded places to do it. It's because there's the news cycles have been on the politics. It's been on COVID. It's been on there were the primaries. There was all the Donald Trump scandals. And so basically the media can only hold 3 or 4 themes at a time. And it's because of that, we haven't had a single mass shooting, and we have tons and tons of them every year. And it's been escalating too, since the 1966. And so we went from having a record number of mass shootings every year, growing, and they're getting bigger, more lethal, more frequent. And then all of a sudden they stop because of COVID.
There was a question, I was going to say, I didn't think I answered it well enough too. Can we predict domestic violence? Absolutely. Men that start battering when they're young continue to do so. And it's men who are not held accountable. So basically people dismiss the behavior. Well, he was really angry. Well, she left him. He loved her so much. He just had to hurt her or whatever. So definitely it's like holding men accountable, holding anybody. I mean, it's just like good parents hold their children accountable when they do something wrong.
By holding them accountable, I assume you're talking about some sort of punishment, or does that actually make any difference? I mean, can batterers stop being batterers?
I think that batterers no. I think that batterers can learn to not be violent, because I told you it gets inconvenient after a while. You can't, what if you, especially the higher your class or socioeconomic status is, the more risky it is for you to be violent, because you don't want the police coming to your nice suburb house or whatever. And it's just not convenient, and it's more easy to manipulate people through other means. But you can't stop them. Those people, like, there is just a certain percentage of the population that are just, they have no soul, or they're cold. They feel entitled. They feel they have a right to control and dominate someone's life. They have a right to destroy somebody. They have a right to beat somebody if they feel like it. And you can't make that go away. I think that there's a handful, or, a few cases of young people who they're not, your frontal lobes aren't fully developed till you're 21. So we'll see a lot more violence in early, like during high school or whatever. But if you were to see your daughter being battered in high school, you would want that relationship to end, because it's not going to get better. And that one will likely escalate before anything. So there's about 15% of the population that has anti-personality disorders, but I would say that not all of that manifests in violence. Not everybody likes to be serial killers. Not everybody likes to rape or batter women. Some people like to steal money. So, like, think about the guy who did the big Ponzi scheme, whatever. He was a psychopath. He didn't really care. He took people's entire, retirements and used it for himself. Number one thing.
One more question is that, what do you think the number one thing, what would be the number one thing that you think might be that we could do to reduce domestic violence?
Absolutely hold someone accountable. And just because you're not a police officer or you're not somebody's mother, I never let that stop me at all. And so say something, do something, report it. I will just be so in people's face about, like, why did you let that happen? What do you mean? The other thing too is domestic violence is not perceived as real violence. And so I see a lot of murderers, go away. And I said that we can't find a good serial killer or a spree killer or a mass shooter or whatever who didn't have a history of domestic violence. You look for them, and there were always something there, in the early years, early in their careers.
When you say they had a history of domestic violence, do you mean they were victims of domestic violence, or they were the perpetrators?
They were the perpetrators. And let's also say this, a lot of times, people are exposed to domestic violence, but a lot of people are perpetrators of domestic violence that never experienced it. And a lot of people were victims of domestic violence or witnessed it, and they grow up and they have, they have issues or problems or relationship problems or whatever, but they don't repeat the pattern. So just because somebody's father battered their mother doesn't make them necessarily a batterer. Just makes somebody with issues.
Is there, you could provide, if someone wants to read more on, perhaps one of your studies or something, would you be willing to provide links that we could share with people after this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Someone asked a good question too. What do we need to do in raising our daughters to help avoid these relationships? Here's the thing is like, what a batter does, they want to socially isolate their victim. That's how you control them. So the batter will want to have the daughter break off a relationship with a family. So anytime your child is hiding a relationship, it's a problem. And it's not because, they're dating somebody you wouldn't approve of or whatever. It's because they're being pulled into something not good, something unhealthy. And I think the thing is to let your daughters know this is not normal, or women. It's like women that we see. And another thing too is like, you see women who get battered and it's like, that is not acceptable. He will never change, whatever. And then sometimes don't assume that these women are all helpless victims. 95% of women who are battered find some way out of the relationship. And then I'll tell you a sad story. I worked on domestic violence study up in Marquette County. And I remember meeting a woman. She was in shelter, and she said she was in shelter at the same time as her husband's girlfriend. And so he was battering both his wife, goes into shelter, battered his girlfriend, goes into shelter. And then what the wife said then was like a month later, he killed the girlfriend. And she says, I was just so relieved when he fixated on somebody else, when he got a new victim. And then she felt so much guilt. So then, he killed somebody else, but she was very tired of being battered, of course. And how effective are these programs for the batters to stop? I don't think that they're so effective. We know that things like coordinated community responses, when the police hold batters accountable, if you arrest perpetrators of violence, don't assume women are crazy. If they're screaming and scared, it's probably because they're scared. The other thing too, we know this. The number of women who kill men, you guys all know about the burning bed, right? Burning bed that happened in Michigan. Farrah Fawcett played this role of this woman who waited until her husband was asleep at night. I think she doused him in gasoline and set him on fire. So she killed him. So the number of women who have killed their batterer has dropped significantly now that we started to arrest perpetrators. If you put bad men in jail or in prison, then women don't need to go into shelter. And why not remove him? Why remove her? And why make her hide? Why make her children have to go someplace else and live or whatever? Why not take him out?
How does Illinois stack up as far as our laws compared to other states?
Well, so here's the thing. So what happened was the Violence Against Women Act was passed, 1, 2, and 3. And now, by the way, it did not pass this last time around, of course, with the Republican holding on to the Senate there. And so basically all states started to develop laws, and I want to say this, it's really complicated, like how many laws are involved with domestic violence or violence against women, because it also includes sexual violence too. And I actually did a study it was an interesting study I did. Can we change judges? So here's the thing, after the Violence Against Women Act was passed, these judges had to learn about all these new rules. They had to stop doing things like victim blaming, because the women who are, victims of domestic violence, a lot of times self-sedate, or they're not a nice, pretty girl. Like I'm trying to think, the Peters, what was the one out in California? I was thinking about this one. If the woman, the guy is treated as a criminal if he has a pretty victim who acts nice. So if his wife is a nice school teacher, does everything right or whatever. But what if she has a substance abuse problem? What if she swears? What if she's missing her teeth? And then the police stop listening to her. But the whole study is, can you get judges to change? And the answer was pretty much no. So I think that you can't, there's some things you can't, like, it's really hard to get people across the stop blaming the victim. It doesn't really matter what she did before. It doesn't really matter that she's an opioid addict or using heroin. It doesn't really matter if she committed crimes. It doesn't matter if she returned to her batter. You have to hold the batter accountable for his own behavior. And so we still see that same problem coming up over and over. We can train people that this is what the law is and you can't, it doesn't really matter what happened before. And you've seen that laws have changed. So for example, just because a woman has consented to sex before with a particular partner doesn't mean that he can't be held accountable for rape. But then, in some states, a lot of states, men cannot be charged for raping their wives. So no, it plays out differently in different states. So there's some other types of violence against women and children that I work on too in Illinois is really, really backwards. And you would think it's a lefty liberal state, I thought, and I've only lived here for about 4 years now. And so I assume they would be more modern, and absolutely not in some things too. So for example, female genital mutilation, it's a crime to cut off your daughter's genitals and sew them up, whatever. But there's never been a case ever reported in the state of Illinois. You have 20,000 of these that happen per year here.
Wow, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that we've all learned quite a bit. It's been very, very interesting and a lot to think about. So thank you for taking the time to share with us this evening. We do appreciate it.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks.